Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. BRICS was going to be the next big thing, a powerful alternative to the U.S.-centric global order. But now, is it slowly fizzling away? Let's get to the bottom line. It started as an informal group of countries that wanted to break the West's stranglehold of the global economy. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and later South Africa were trying to find ways to reduce their dependency on the U.S. dollar. Over the years, the BRICS have expanded to include more than a dozen new members and partners, representing half the world's population and more than a third of its wealth. But with each expansion, the goalposts seem to shift. And U.S. President Donald Trump keeps threatening to hit them hard if they ever become, quote, meaningful. So are the dreams of becoming a major political force in the world order, even an alternative to the G7, basically dead? Today we're talking with the economist who coined the name BRIC more than 20 years ago, Jim O'Neill, member of the UK House of Lords and former chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management. Lord O'Neill, Jim, great to have you on the show. It's really been 25 years since you coined the term BRIC. Lots of people have celebrated you for doing this in awkward ways, because I want you to tell the story, but to some degree you used it as an acronym for countries out there, not a geopolitical movement. But tell us more.
Well, actually, it is 25 years this November. And when I reflect on all the remarkable things going on in the past few months, I frequently return to where has everybody been for 25 years? Because even though I created it as an acronym, the first paper I ever wrote, and I frequently say I don't think many people really read it, was all about global governance and how coming a year after the start of the Eurozone and key European countries all sharing a common currency and economic policy framework, I effectively argued for a revamp of the G7 in which Europe would be represented by one place, let's call it the Eurozone, and the four BRIC countries should be brought into the center of global policymaking. And here we are, 2 decades and a half later, where finally, partly because of the oddities of President Trump, but also by the wonderful, honest speech of Mark Carney in Davos, people are waking up to what seemed pretty obvious to me for so long. So it's kind of quite exciting for me.
Well, I think one of the questions that I have out there is, to some degree, the dollar, which you've written so extensively about, the dominance of the dollar as a reserve currency status, was really as much an effect of the post-World War II order as many of the other institutions that are out there. And we've seen the weight of those institutions, the erosion of them, as time has gone on, in part because the Brazils, the Indias were not brought in to those institutions of power. And so a lot of people have been kind of on a dollar death watch. But the dollar has been the one area that you said has this built-in resilience. And it may not follow the same pattern as the decay and, shifting that's going on right now in the international system. Do I have that right?
This is an increasing thought in my head, and here where I probably disagree with the international academic monetary consensus, that a lot of people, and myself often have said that the dollar will never be challenged in our lifetimes because there's no alternative. But the more I think about it, the reality is we will only know in hindsight after the dollar's been challenged. And the interplay between forces of, let's call it, push from America, where you have somebody like Donald Trump so aggressively expressing this desire for the US not to be the world's policeman as such, is a bit of simplification, but that, and playing away at the institutional history and dominance of the US, and therefore linked to that, but separately also the pull of many other countries thinking, we need to reduce our dependency on the United States. And this is particularly true for the BRICS countries, but it's obviously also true for Europe too. And so at some point, and who knows, it might have started now, the Europeans might be in the early stages of putting things together to really make the single market work and to have one serious common Eurobond across the whole Eurozone. And, China and India might start treating each other a lot more respectfully and doing things together. And these are the sort of things that will bring around an end to the dollar's dominance. Because if you look at it based on pure economics, the really striking feature of the 25 years or longer since I thought of the BRICS thing and beyond, the US economy is a smaller share of global GDP than it was. It's still the biggest. And yet the dollar still plays this remarkably dominant role. But saying all of this as a British person, we know here that the pound ended up losing its reserve currency status in the style of which these things were in those days, quite a bit after the UK's decline as the dominant economy. So, as light follows dark or night follows day and vice versa, at some point in the future, the dollar won't be the world's dominant reserve currency. But, quite when remains to be seen. And I really think we'll only know after it's happened.
Jim, I co-hosted some senior administration, trade, and treasury officials. And what really came out was the focus of U.S. policymakers on de-risking the U.S. economy from China. But what the European officials were there saying is, we're de-risking our economy from the United States.
The idea that the United States can de-risk itself from China when the US completely depends on foreign savings to fund the domestic weakness of savings for all its investment requirements. And the flip side of that China has very large savings and more than it seems to currently need for its domestic investment requirements. The way that the balance of payments ends up being an accounting equation is you get a lot of Chinese capital outflows and a lot of US capital inflows. And the flip side of that means that you're going to get persistent US trade and current account deficits, whatever is superficially claimed about tariffs, and a very large Chinese current account surplus. In fact, I think we've just had China's current account surplus for last year being a record size of global GDP. So this idea of this sort of notional de-risking is sort of clever sort of politics playing to the domestic audiences, but it's kind of fantasy land in my opinion, unless as part of the US strategy, there is a deliberate, sustained and serious effort to raise domestic savings within the overall US economy. So the US reduces its need for foreign capital. But as soon as I say that, when you see Trump and his guys talking so proudly and almost boasting about how much foreign capital is coming from whatever part of the world, by definition, that means they are going to be sustaining very large trade and current account deficits as far as the eye can see, until some other part of the world decides we've had enough of accumulating the US assets and we decide to put them somewhere else. And that in itself will play back into what we were just talking about a few minutes ago with the sustainability of the dollar being such a dominant currency.
I want to show our audience a tweet of concern by President Donald Trump. I want to read it here. I'm going to read it fully. The idea that the BRICS countries are trying to move away from the dollar while we stand by and watch is over, all capital letters. We're going to require a commitment from these seemingly hostile countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty US dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs and should expect to say goodbye to selling into the wonderful US economy. They can go find another sucker nation. There is no chance that BRICS will replace the US dollar in international trade or anywhere else. And any country that tries should say hello to tariffs and goodbye to America. Very colorful note. I would like to get your view on this note, because it sounds like he's punching at a straw man, because as you've argued, there's no real chance in the near term that this could happen.
So, after I saw that tweet from Trump, and not long ago, I'm not sure if it was before or after, he inadvertently made a mistake at a press conference where I think it was a Spanish journalist asked him about all of this, and he started going on about Spain being part of the BRICS. So I'm kind of like, I don't, first of all, it's kind of really good for me personally, because I don't remember a single US president ever mentioning the BRICS at all before. And secondly, more serious, sort of jokingly, I ended up writing a piece saying, perhaps Donald Trump is some kind of secret agent for the BRICS, because by saying all of these things, it effectively legitimizes the BRICS political club more. And even more importantly than that important fact, it of course makes the leaders of these countries think much more seriously about indeed creating an alternative financial state of affairs where they're not so dependent or economically with the US. And there are many, many, many examples I could cite. The fact that India's leader Modi visited Beijing early this year for the first time in 7 years is quite a large development. Now, most of it is probably symbolic, but as I've talked about a lot in the past, and indeed again recently, if India and China were to really start to treat each other in a very cooperative spirit with respect to trade especially, but also other matters, then a lot of these countries and the rest of the world wouldn't care what the leader of the United States says. Because at the end of the day, as big as the US is at 25% of global GDP, that means the rest of the world is 75% of GDP. And if the rest of the world starts doing more and more of its trade with each other, and by default or choice, less with the United States, we're going to get into a world where people won't care what the leader of the US is saying. And I have to say, and I wish I'd be at one of those dinners of yours, I often don't get how the intellectual leadership of the United States doesn't understand these kind of things a bit better. Never mind the fact that we're also coincidentally, and despite this, living in an era where US global services companies are obviously benefiting dramatically from all of this sort of interplay. So, there's a lot of quite amusing, seen from somebody that lives outside the US, sort of fun and games as it relates into the domestic US political state of affairs. But a lot of it is just kind of hot air. And if the US isn't careful with some of the steps it takes on this, it might actually accelerate its relative economic decline, or should I put it another way, the relative acceleration of the rise of some of these other countries. And again, I'll just use the India-China example again. As I've written in some pretty detailed pieces quite a long time in the past, but they're so valid today. If India and China were to do significant free trade things together, and it involved other important Asian countries and beyond, the boost to their economies and the boost to global trade would be absolutely ginormous. And the idea that the US would want to, US multinationals wanting to shut themselves off from that, I think, is extremely far-fetched.
Do you think China has any interest in continuing to perpetuate the BRICS club?
So that is a fascinating question. And I should say at this moment, by the way, bit of free advertising, I'm in the process of developing a sort of virtual, let's call it platform for academics and thinkers around the world to do some more serious research about many of these kind of issues. Because one of the other fascinating things is within the BRICS Plus expanded club, there's now 10 members, it often seems that they don't really have a clear strategy and coordinated platform. And this is going to be one of the areas that we're focusing on. And so with that in mind, we're going to call it BRICS Plus thinking. One of the things which is central to that is what you've just raised. And my own opinion is that China sort of likes the whole BRICS thing because it allows them to promote this idea that China's a champion of the global south and emerging markets as such. And that's why the Chinese especially are eager for the BRICS Plus to become BRICS Plus Plus. And there's a number of other countries that have been asked to consider joining and are thinking of it. And that's what China really loves. Are the Chinese going to give up the independence of the People's Bank of China in order to have a currency that's a bit like a sort of BRICS version of the euro? Very, very, very unlikely and not in my lifetime. And of course, there are very complex issues to do with the history of China and India and many other countries in the global south. The Indians think that they are the actual natural heirs to being the champions of the global south. And so there's a lot of really historic and complex international relations issues here. But I do think in order for them to get a louder voice and ultimately to have a bigger warranted voice at the center of a better structure of global multilateral institutions, the BRICS countries need to have a more coherent strategy between themselves as well.
I'm interested in what you see the implications are for middle powers in the world and what their options are if America is the new predatory hegemon.
Well, as I think I said at the start, but to home in on it more, if I look at the whole thrust of Donald Trump's leadership on these issues and Mark Carney's fantastic speech, I joke with him and people close to him the day after that, you know, he's given purpose to Davos, which hasn't existed to the previous 20 years, because at last people are talking, you know, openly and honestly about things that have been so obvious to me for so long. And of course, many of these so-called middle powers, or even bigger ones, or ones that like to think of themselves as bigger, have been so sucked into this never-ending dependence on the United States. And now they realize that maybe it's not so smart thing to do. And some of them, as Mark is boldly and bravely leading the push on, are like, we're actually not just going to sit around thinking about it. We're going to actually try and do something about it. And again, I link it back to some of the other issues we've touched on. You know, if the US seriously wants to reduce its trade and current account deficits, that means it's going to start importing a lot less. The only way that that's really going to be successfully happening on a sustained basis is by some deliberate act for the US to raise its domestic savings rates. Now, in the process of doing that, it reduces consumption. Which US political leader is going to do that with the 4-year election cycle and the 2-year congressional cycle? Good luck. And moreover, if they are bold enough to do that, and one can see why ultimately that might be sensible for the United States, but if they are going to do that, that means the rest of the world wouldn't want to have its historic dependence with the United States because it wouldn't be getting the economic benefit of sending so much stuff to the US that it historically got. And already, and hence why it is so much more complicated than this really simplistic, out-of-date thing about China being a communist nation and all the rest of it. In so many different markets around the world, China for a long time is the single biggest importer of this stuff. And, you know, it's particularly clear for many countries that are adjacent to it in China, in Asia, whether it's Japan or South Korea.
You know, one of the other features of the global economy that's been with us for decades, and I don't know if it's still as solid as it used to be, is, you know, oil and gas politics. Now they're saying, hey, the new oil and gas politics are GPUs and data centers and the AI race. As you kind of look at these two areas, you know, we're on the verge of something in Iran, perhaps, but you look at oil and gas, which I would put in the traditional concern box, but you're also looking at the power of AI and the amassing of, you know, electrification and power. What are the two, how do those two drivers fit into your sense of instability in the global economy?
The thing that grows in my mind, and some really obviously key leadership people in the whole AI game realize this themselves, that, and yet again, this is another reason why the US can't realistically sort of de-risk itself from China. You know, the US doesn't have enough energy, despite what it's done with shale gas, which is incredibly impressive over the past 2 decades plus. It can't give everything it needs energy-wise to the AI demand. And this could be a problem for especially the financial markets assessment of the value of these AI companies, because they're not going to be able to have the power to generate it unless the US does something a lot smarter about its energy supplies. You know, I was really struck when Donald Trump came to the UK earlier in the year for a couple of days and had a lot of these tech guys with him. And all over the British news, literally the #1 story was all this sudden talk about God knows where in the United Kingdom was going to be an AI data center. And there was even some talk about small modular reactors being specially created by these AI companies to provide it. And one of the really interesting things about that is it caused a bit of a backlash, because for those of us focused on regional issues in the UK, and I've devoted a decade plus to that since I left Goldman, you know, it's been obvious that the UK should be developing these things for our own energy security and price needs. So the idea that the UK is going to do that just because the US needs it for its AI centers, I think is, to be honest, a bit far-fetched. But all of these things are very complicated. And what is ultimately, from what I can see at the moment, China's ability to support its own AI rollout with enormous electricity generating power seems to be a lot more straightforward than it currently is for the United States.
I could just learn from you all day. I would love to have long conversations all the time. But let me just finish, Jim. Of course, you were the conceptualizer of BRICS. Now, some are saying you've moved to a new acronym, MINT, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. And you particularly like Mexico and Nigeria. You're kind of cold on Indonesia. Sorry, folks. Don't know where you are on Turkey. But is it important to kind of continually to change and rethink which nations or clusters of countries could in fact represent a compelling challenge to the system as it is?
Well, you know, I laugh when you say that. That acronym was created by a BBC journalist on my behalf to persuade me to travel around those countries. It wasn't my idea.
I see.
And it's about 10 years ago. But very importantly, more seriously, you know, these are four of the countries out of part of what a group I used to call the Next 11, which is the 11 largest populated emerging nations after the BRICS. And even more importantly, in terms of BRICS Plus, and taking it back to a lot of what we've touched on, one of them, Indonesia, that a decade on from when I did that series, has actually navigated all the ups and downs of the world economy way better than I would have imagined. Crucially, Indonesia is now the 10th member of the BRICS Club Plus. And after India, it is arguably the most interesting large populated country in the world, because it has extremely youthful labor force dynamics. And so if Indonesia can get its act together, you know, Indonesia, which is a big if, a very big if, but if it did, Indonesia could generate 8 to 10% growth for the next 3 decades. And so, yeah, places like this are hugely exciting. Nigeria, 20% of Africa's population. By 2050 or sometime after, if that sort of crazy place, exciting nation manages to stay together as one and somehow starts to go on a better path of governance and leadership, you know, Nigeria is easily going to be one of the most exciting nations in the planet. And so, of course, many people around the world, I'm not the only person that knows this, to put it mildly, there are lots of really exciting places where it's in everybody's interest that they do better themselves, and bringing it right back to this rather odd period of the United States where it seems to think of everything in a zero-sum game, despite the fact it's pretty obvious its own major companies and people are benefiting from it. You know, the US is not, I don't think, very likely to cut itself off from it permanently, even if it is very fashionable to pretend that it's going to do in the near future.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Economist Jim O'Neill, member of the UK House of Lords, thank you for helping us to think big on these issues today. Real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. Been a pleasure.
So what's the bottom line? What began as an ambitious bid to rebalance the dominance of the dollar over the global economy, well, it now faces a lot of structural headwinds. There are divergent national interests and uneven growth and widening political differences among its members. Expansion has added a lot of symbolism, but not cohesion. Meanwhile, existing power centers from the G7 to regional blocs, well, they continue to set most of the global agenda. The question isn't whether BRICS disappears, but whether it can evolve from a slogan of multipolarity into a mechanism that actually delivers it. That just doesn't seem to be in the cards. And that's the bottom line.